My name is Steve Garwin, and I'm working as a consultant for American Eagle Gold on their NAC porphyry system in the Babine district of British Columbia. And what the team has asked me to do is to have a look at their digital data. I have not been to site and give my opinions on the controls to the copper, gold, molybdenum mineralization in the NAC porphyry system. And determine what might assist in helping the company find more resources and extend exploration in the district. So that's what I'll be sharing with you today. This is the result of about 5 days of study. So this is a company slide that has been put out in press releases. This is from April. And basically just to show that there are some good hundreds of meters of interesting intercepts using copper, gold, silver, molybdenum. Most of the value in the drilling to date is in the copper and the gold. And you can see the scale there, bottom right-hand corner, 500 meters. So you have this Babine porphyry stock, very simplified here, with the western and southern margin having proven mineralization. And you can see the companies talking about a northern zone that's higher in copper and a southern zone that, in addition to the copper, has significant amounts of gold. So what I've done here is I've taken the company database and draped that same slide we looked at previously on top of topography. And then we have the surface sample results, basically colored by a ratio of copper over zinc, which I find is a good indicator of proximity to the hotter part of the porphyry systems, which is often where you want to be if you're looking for copper and gold. And the size of these various surface samples are molybdenum, and molybdenum is a good proximity indicator of porphyry systems. So we're basically looking at three variables here: copper, zinc, and moly, draped upon the sort of cartoon of the previous slide. And you can see there's big dots that mean they have a lot of moly, and the higher colors such as magenta and red and orange means there's high copper over zinc. And then the black dots are historic and recent drill holes. Now, a bit of this, and we'll see in subsequent slides, is covered by till. So that means it's a little harder to find things, but of course the opportunity is if you drill beneath the till, there's a lot of stuff that could be hidden that hadn't been found by previous explorers. So this looks interesting right now with the large dots and high colors of copper over zinc. Now we're seeing it just with the sort of the topography. And what I've done here is cut a cross section, east-west section, kind of looking through from south to north, looking north through all the data. And we can see where I have topography as a 3D surface here in gray. I'm just going to turn on my pointer here. Those dots have been draped, those dots being surface sample results, rocks and soils and till, have been draped on top of the topography. And this is just outside the area of interest. So I don't have topography, so they're sitting at zero. And so the surface elevations here are up around 1,100 meters to 1,000 meters or so. And so those are those previous surface samples, color-coded by copper over zinc, sized by molybdenum. And these are drill holes, which are color-coded by copper equivalent. And here in the drill hole database, the copper equivalent takes into account copper, gold, and silver, not molybdenum, which is pretty minor in terms of an economic contribution. And then these planes here are 3D models that American Eagle have made based upon drilling of the geometry of important dikes, faults, stratigraphy, the Babine stock, and whatnot. So to make things a little clearer in viewing, I'm going to show you a series of sort of level plans looking downwards. And it's a little hard to see when you've got all this sort of 3D model projected to surface. So I've basically made a cutting plane and inclined it about 6 degrees towards the west. And so that's what you'll be seeing in the subsequent sort of district plan views of a 90-meter width. So it cuts out a lot of those models, and we'll see those in much more detail in subsequent slides in the drill area. But this is just for the sake of visualization. So now we're looking back down on that same slide we showed previously, but now you see I've kind of cut out, you don't see the 3D models at surface right now. You don't see quite all the surface sample because they're outside that 90-meter window. All right. So again, your eye is drawn to obviously this portion of the system south of the Babine stock where there's good surface sampling, and obviously where there's a lot of drill holes and we have good results. It's not well expressed in the surface sampling because remember, this is covered by glacial till over 20 meters thick locally. So now we're seeing those sliced upper portions of the modeled dikes and intrusions, and they have names here. DSE is dike, serrate dikes, and they've using, the company is using various trace elements such as high scandium, low niobium to help differentiate these various dikes. There's the important are these red dikes called copper dikes, as they are related to copper and gold locally. These purple dikes are these serrate dikes, which seem also to be very important. And you'll see that in the next series of slides in localizing grade. I mean, this is a porphyry system, but yet there are higher grade plunging zones of higher copper and gold that relate to the intersections of dikes along the margin of the Babine stock, IBS. And then there's this northerly trending dike swarm, which also seems to have been focusing a lot of the mineralization along the western margin of the Babine stock labeled as IBS here. And then also you can see here these sort of colored contours. And what this is basically taking the copper equivalent and drill hole and doing very simple numerical models, sort of connecting the dots and making a series of isosurfaces, which is a good guide for future exploration. This is just to show you the overburden, the glacial till, which is over 20 meters thick, maybe even more in places. And this block here is the area that American Eagle have modeled in 3 dimensions for the sort of base of cover. And you can see much of the system drilled to date is covered, all right? And these black dots, again, are drill holes. Some are historic and many are more recent, going down hundreds of meters. And so what that might mean is that some of these surface samples may not absolutely represent bedrock, yet the location is compelling in terms of where they sit with respect to the geology and represent good drill targets. So again, we're seeing the traces of some of the key dikes that are peeking through the model here, if you will, the cover of the overburden. And again, there's just this geometry. The geometry is really key in determining what the intrusive system saw when it came in and fractured the adjacent rocks and moved through the stratigraphy, which we'll talk about. It's a fracture-controlled permeability, and this is where they're depositing out quartz veins and the metals that people ultimately will mine. So again, I think that's one of the most important things in exploration is there's a chronology, which intrusion came first, which came later, which came last, but understanding the spatial distribution. What are the spatial controls, the empirical controls to mineralization, and using that geometric understanding to explore and add to, in this case, evolve what will be an evolving resource will grow with time. Okay, so now we're seeing again these various dikes as modeled, and you're seeing all these isosurfaces here. This is just made by running a very simple isotropic, so you just 1-to-1-to-1 model of the surface sample results. Okay, and again, this has been sliced, so we're not seeing some of the surface samples, all right, because they're outside that window. Just so that way this model here is a series of very narrow planes or lines rather than large, long planes that go down hundreds of meters and obscure our understanding of the near surface. So these dikes are important. Okay, you can start seeing this dike here, this serrate dike, low niobium, seems to run right through and has a relationship to the surface mineralization, as do some of these other serrate dikes, okay? And we know the copper dikes are also very important. And again, you can see the margin in pink here of the Babine stock and the northerly trending dike swarm, all important geometric elements for further exploration and extending the known mineralization to depth to the north, to the south, and to the east. This deposit's open in a lot of directions. Now, this is a very similar summary I just drew on in PowerPoint of showing 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, 1% copper equivalent as modeled from the drill data. So those are sort of isosurfaces projected to surface from the drill data compared to these sort of 3D isosurfaces made from the surface data. Now we're starting to see some pretty compelling geometry. You really want to be around the edge of the Babine stock. Look at all that elevated copper over zinc and molybdenum. All good signs. And what I've done here is I've drawn some lines, which you'll see how I did this from subsequent slides. I used the geophysics, magnetics, IP resistivity, and extended these dikes. And they seem to have a pretty good relationship with mineralization from the surface samples, although some of it is till cover. So this is now starting to build a framework for where one might look for satellite discoveries. And look at the scale here. This is 750-meter grid. This is a large area. So there are some regional exploration targets, very simply made based upon being around the margin of the stock, which seems to be important, associated with high copper over zinc and molybdenum, and these sort of intersections of these dike extensions. And you'll see also, these will be magnetic gradients. You can see this in geophysical databases. So very simple-minded. This is the known discovery, which is open. And here are areas that I would recommend, and I believe the company is also going after this. This isn't news to American Eagle. There are a good bunch of geologists here who've done excellent work. And again, I've just compiled the work they've done and given my opinion, based upon limited work, but having seen many deposits and worked on discoveries globally. Okay, so now what we have here is that same model, but now I've taken out I've taken out the 3D models for sake of clarification or clarity of presentation. So you don't see those 3D models here of the dikes. And we're seeing all the drill traces here. They're not filtered off, and we're seeing all the surface samples. They haven't been cut off. And again, these contours here are related to copper over zinc in surface samples. So the bigger the dots, the higher molybdenum, the greater the color, going all the way from blue up to magenta through orange and red is the higher copper over zinc. It's where you want to be exploring. Again, we're just putting on the Babine stock. Again, this is, it's a lot unknown here because a lot of it's not outcropping, it's covered. This is a summary of the copper equivalent using copper, gold, and silver and drill hole projected to surface. And you can see, of course, there's not a lot, there's no drill holes here. And some of these drill holes here are historic and only go down tens of meters. So this thing has really only been tested properly here. Okay, over about less than about a 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometer strike length. And these are my prospective lineaments, which are, you can see in the geochem, you can see in the extension of the dikes that have been modeled and drilled in the West. And you can see in the geophysics, which you'll see justification for that in the following slides. So again, there's some compelling targets, in my opinion. So now this is the TMI, total magnetic intensity. This is kind of the first pass often what you would get from some sort of geophysical contractor that did a ground mag or aeromagnetic survey that might give you something like this, all right? And you can see there's quite a magnetic body. This hasn't been corrected for remnants or other things, but we can now see how that's going to be related to the dikes. I haven't drawn the dikes here. I'm just kind of giving you an idea of where they are. You can go back to previous slides for that. There's the dike swarm that seems to be very important, northerly dike swarm, which is focused and spatially related to the discovery to date. There's the IBS, the Babine stock, and its margin. This is a summary of the copper equivalent, gold, copper, and silver in drill hole, projected to surface. These are my potentially mineralized structures or dike trends, extending the known trends and looking at geophysics to assist. These are the targets. Again, we're looking for structural intersections. It's clearly there's a big, strong northerly, northwesterly, and to northwesterly, and even northeasterly control. So the intersections of those sorts of oriented structures, particularly if there's known dikes, particularly if they're altered in some way, would be great targets. Now, this is an analytical signal which is a little bit different than the TMI or reduced to the pole. This can deal if there's some sort of remnant magnetism. In other words, if the Earth's magnetic field was flipped from where it is today, when these magnetic bodies, the intrusions were placed, analytical signal will give you a different center for the presence of the magnetic body than a reduced to the pole or total magnetic intensity. It's just another way of looking at the data. So now we're seeing, again, we've screened off some of the surface samples. We're looking at this plane inclined. The plane's inclined to the west about 6 degrees, but we're looking down. Just to give you a general idea of the geometry, there's the dikes form, there's the stock, there's the projection, surface projection of the drill hole results, isosurfaced. There's the corridors of interest. There's the regional targets. Now, this is the second vertical derivative of the reduced to the pole. Just other ways of looking at data. I wouldn't get fussed. Is it first vertical derivative? Is it horizontal gradient magnitude? Second vertical derivative. It's just ways of looking at the data. And this way of looking at the data gives us a wonderful structural grain. Okay? So if it's magnetic, well, if it's got a high second vertical derivative, high gradient, it's going to give you magentas. If it's got a lower gradient, it's going to give you blues. So now you can clearly see this pattern. You can see the northerly trend of the dike swarm in the deposit through here in this zone of higher second vertical derivative. And you can see this lovely contrast here. Strong north-north westerly trends. And you can see how it relates to the known intrusions that are well constrained, certainly on the west side where they've been drilled. This is IP chargeability. So this is telling you about the amount of sulfide, particularly pyrite, which is one of the most chargeable sulfides, much more than chalcopyrite or bornite. And so what we have here, and of course the company is published this, you've got this chargeable halo, all right? And I believe this is in milliseconds. So this is a several percent sulfide inferred beneath the till, and this sort of chargeable low. And you can see the known mineralization to date is sitting kind of just on the inside of this chargeable annulus. So what's intriguing then is, and the companies mentioned this too, American Eagle. So what happens if we go around the donut, which happens to be the margins of the stock? What a great idea. And now you can see how that relates to the known drill holes and data from that. And again, some of these drill holes are very shallow and historic. So I don't say that this area has been tested because there's a couple drill holes there. And there's only one drill hole there. So look at this. So, yes, there is a donut. I would go to these 4 areas first to test the donut, but ultimately this is wide open here. So that's encouraging. This is resistivity. So if it's blue, it's got a low resistivity, or it's conductive. In other words, that would be consistent with lots of clays or micas, for example, particularly sericites, phyllic alteration. And then the resistive bit would be more propylitic alteration or non-clay bearing rocks. And again, we get this sort of annular pattern consistent with this chargeable and conductive annulus, which would be clay pyrite or phyllic alteration. So this is what exploration geologists do. This is why this data is collected. It can be processed even further, but you have magnetics. In this case, we have IP, chargeability, electrical methods. We have geology, we have geochemistry, and we target the best areas to find what we're looking for. Okay, so now I'm taking it back and I'm sort of simplifying, going back to that original slide that we started with this sort of screened out window of the surface results and the drill holes and the summary of the gold zone to the south, copper rich zone to the north. And you can see the copper equivalents. So that gold pumps up the copper equivalent here to over 1% copper equivalent locally. The structures of interest and the regional exploration targets. And then also the company has mapped chalcopyrite, and malachite and outcrop. So obviously these will add targets, even though we don't have a great geochemical expression. We have outcropping copper mineralization. So I would add that to the targets of interest. So now we're back to the original slide, very simple, black dots showing where there's existing drill holes and historical drill holes and targets that based upon what I've shared with you. Now there's many ways to do this sort of thing. There's no one unique way to prospect and use geology and geophysics to find ore. This is just one method. And a number of these targets the company had already came up with, So there you go. Now, let's go into detail. You can see the scale here. It's a 500-meter grid. This is right down on the area of drilling, okay? Showing the left-hand diagram is copper equivalent percent, again, using copper, gold, and silver in drill hole, color-coded in 10 meters. They're 10-meter composites. Most of the assay samples every 2 or 3 meters. Here we've kind of lumped it to 10 meters. For ease of visualization. In any sort of resource models, you probably will be looking at lumping it a bit. And there's the grades. So less than 0.1% copper equivalent up to over 1%. You can see the magentas are high grade. This is looking down on the 3D geology model. See, it's quite busy and hard to see through. So we're going to do a series of horizontal slices or level plans and go down every 100 meters looking plus or minus 25 meters from that plane. So we're going to be looking at 50-meter thick wafers through 1,000 meters of drilling, okay? And seeing how that relates to what we're looking for, which is copper, gold, silver, and some molybdenum. So this model is all done by the company geologists, okay? They've done a wonderful job, and I've labeled various dikes, and I've even labeled a bit of stratigraphy. So this is the base of what's called the middle conglomerate, which is dipping off to the northeast. And the top of that will be coming in and as we go down deeper. And there's a whole series of stratigraphy dipping shallowly or gently to the northeast here. But the primary controls are these steeply dipping dikes, fracture zones, margins of intrusions. So speaking of margins of intrusions, this is the Babine stock is modeled at 1,000 meters, so very close above sea level, very close to surface. And this gray area is this northerly trending dike swarm, okay? So remember, we saw that previously. Now we're going to look at it as a series of level slices. And then what I've done is I made a very simple numerical model with no anisotropy. In other words, X equals Y equals Z. I'm not biasing any sort of variography towards the trend of the dikes. And it basically summarizes the copper equivalent at this sort of RL. Okay, so you can see there's a good zone of up to over 0.5% to percent copper equivalent here, and another zone here. And we'll see how that goes as we slice our way down through the 3D model. So I'm also going to show you at the end of each sort of series of level plans a longitudinal section, which kind of goes through the guts of everything, right, through most of the drill holes. And that will be a bit of projection each side on that section. It won't be covering this area out in here. But we got the level plans to do this. So on the right-hand diagram at 1,000 meters RL, here's where I think the deposit is open in red. So all I've done is said, well, look, there's good values here, and there's good values here, and there's hardly any drill holes in between. There is one drill hole there, but why wouldn't you put some holes in there to see if this just continues right across and adds significant amounts to your resource? This is completely open down in here. This, I believe, is open up in here, as you'll see as we go down. So it's not just around the margin of the Babine stock, IBS, it's actually in it as well. So now on the left is a 900-meter slot down 100 meters, and like a 50-meter wafer above 25 meters from 900 meters RL and below that. And here's 800 meters. So I'm just going to show you these slices as you go down. And again, you can obviously see there's some areas that don't have many drill holes and no drill holes to close off some of this and some of that. So there we've labeled the various 3D models that the company has made. And what I want you to start focusing on is the relationship of these dike trends and their intersections to the copper equivalent. Okay, so we also see that there's quite a bit that's open, all right, where more drilling is required. As equal as amount that's been drilled, you can go to the north and south and east and at depth. Getting a bit more closed here. So here's the conglomerate that seems to be a prospective host. But it's not the only host because there's stratigraphy below it and there's stratigraphy above it that hosts where you're nearby the dikes. So the dikes are the main conduits, all right? Even if they're pre-mineral or post-mineral, they're outlining structures, steeply dipping structures and fracture zones that have been filled by copper, gold, silver, and molybdenum. So you can see from here to here is in that stratigraphy that's dipping gently to the northeast. And you can see these sorts of intersection zones. This is a good intersection between the two red copper dikes. This is a lovely intersection between the low niobium Seriate dike and the copper dike, gives you nice grades. We get these little blowouts and little feathering bits of copper dikes. Another intersection here, the various Seriate dikes. These are the things that look, to me, very attractive. So we can really start seeing the grade opening up as you get about 300 meters below surface, although it goes to surface essentially. It's just geometry. Look at this intersection zone here. What's not to like, right? You know, you've got intersections and splays in these copper dikes in red. You've got these Seriate dikes crossing it. Here, another lovely intersection zone. Even though it's a porphyry, there will probably be higher grade mega chutes, okay, related to this increased fracture permeability and dike intersection, which have guided the ascending copper-rich fluids. Look at this lovely zone in here. You know, all sorts of dikes are intersecting there. And again, you get a little pearl. And this is not a little pearl. I mean, that's 150 meter by 150 meter pearl. All right. It's a big string. It's a big necklace. A lot of tons. Okay, so I'm just kind of saying, well, geez, it looks like there's a lot of room for more drilling. That's all those red things are. There's no unique way to do this. Clearly, the company has their own plans of how they're going to extend the deposit and put in more holes, and they'll prioritize as they go. So again, it's all about the hot spots, and just look how open. You know, that's just wonderful. All right, so that obviously there's a lot of room to drill. Okay, and you do this going downwards. And you can see as we grow deeper, the holes don't go to, all of them go to depth. So we have less and less data going down. Now we're over 1,000 meters below surface, and not one drill hole has penetrated that deep. And only 3 have penetrated to the 100-meter RL, or about 900 meters or so below surface. All right, and you can see we have labeled up the various dikes, and you can see how the dikes aren't vertical, so they're shifting across the page from near surface to depth. The conglomerate base started off here, and as we go further deeper, we're going down and down and getting into deeper stratigraphy here. And again, these dikes are modeled from drilling from higher up. But again, obviously, these intersection zones would be great places to drill deeper should grade justify. Okay, so this is a longitudinal section, which I'll just pop backwards, is going kind of right down the guts of the whole thing, crossing most of the drill holes, but it's only looking plus or minus 50 meters. So it's a 100-meter wide corridor of information. And this is the IBS in pink. And then I've labeled all the dikes. Again, all of these models were made by American Eagle Gold geologists. They've done a fantastic job. And the geometry is key. Without these models, it'd be a lot harder to target. And you can see, well, there's interesting things going on here. We've got, first of all, this is color-coded by copper equivalent. And you can see that each grid is 300 meters. So that's well over a kilometer, right? And you can see that there's large areas of high copper equivalent grade here and here and here that are open. And you can see these dike intersections, I think, are quite interesting. Look where all these, sure, the copper dike isn't flat here, but we're subparallel to it. So the apparent trace is looking quite flat. Look at these intersection zones of the copper dikes and these feathered dikes as modeled right on top of the IBS or Babine stock. So again, here's where one could go and just keep growing the deposit from near surface to down to 1,000 meters depth. It's open, and it's even open into the east, into the Babine stock. So now, all right, that's great. So that's what you get when you get assays. Now let's say, and this is what we do as geologists, we use a 20x hand lens, or like a jeweler's loop, and we look really hard at the rock, and we log things that are important. And in most porphyries, that's different intrusion types and the chronology of the intrusions, when they came to the porphyry party. Are they early, or have they come later and diluted? Which one's focus grade? We do that. We look at the abundance of quartz veins and fracture abundance, because again, fracture permeability is how we get fluids through these rocks. And then, of course, we look at where the copper and the gold and the silver and the molybdenum is sitting, and that's in sulfide minerals, which we can see with our 20x hand lens. And if you've got 14 drill rigs turning on a project, you can't afford to wait anywhere from 4 weeks to 8 weeks for the assays to come back. The good news in porphyry coppers, we can see the copper minerals. It's not like some gold systems or where you can't see the gold if they're fine grained. You have to wait for the assays. So this is really an important thing for porphyry explorationists to do. And this is something that gets wrapped into something called the anaconda method, which is just a good way of mapping and logging data and recording it and using it to find more of what you're looking for. So here we're looking at basically the iron copper sulfides. So the guys have been logging from their drill logs how much bornite, chalcocite, chalcopyrite, pyrrhotite, and pyrite. There is some covellite, but it's quite minor. So they're logging in volume percent. They're looking at, diagrams that say, is this 0.1%, 0.2, 0.5, 5% in their hand lens field of view. And I went ahead and added all that up. And so this is basically all those minerals added up, it's volume percent, and that's what these models are. So again, these drill holes are color-coded by copper equivalent because that's what we're looking for. That's the money. But now we're using something that we can see in the hand lens. We don't have to wait for assays to come back for all the total sulfides. And so you're seeing you're locally up to over 4% volume percent total sulfides. And in this deposit, it's mostly chalcopyrite and bornite, lesser pyrite. The chalcocite is not so abundant. Pyrrhotite, pretty rare. So now let's just look at the relationship. There are the dikes again. Well, it's modeled in the stratigraphy and the stock. There's where the long section is going to be. Now I'm going to compare what you can see with logging to the copper equivalent greater than 0.28% that I made from modeling from the assays. Very simple, okay? And you can see, well, there's a pretty good relationship there. Now we're slicing and going downwards. And again, obviously these intersection zones are just dynamite, right? And this north-south corridor from the dike swarm is dynamite. And again, pretty good comparison of logged sulfide abundance to copper. Here, okay, a little bit different. It's a little bit lower copper there, less than 0.2%, but we get it coming in deeper, just informed from one hole, okay? And this is largely chalcopyrite and bornite, okay? And I'll show you that in subsequent slides. So this is great because you can use your hand lens and predict where you are in the system, and you don't have to wait for assays. And if you start stepping up to multiple drill rigs, this is what you need to do. It makes all the drilling more efficient. You know when to stop the hole because you've run down out of sulfides, etc. So again, you can see that it's a very good prediction. A little bit different here. Lower copper here, still at 0.1%, but less than 0.2% equivalent, and some elevated sulfides, mostly chalcopyrite. I'll show you that. All right. So again, I'm just pulling out the things that geologists pull out to enable and assist the company in making real-time decisions on the drill rig, which will make a more efficient use of their dollars and to target ore more readily, not having to wait for assays. Good. All right. That's fine. And the long section's lovely. So again, that's north, that's south. And one thing I didn't mention in the previous long sections, I've outlined the base and the top of that middle conglomerate. All right. So there's stratigraphy above it and stratigraphy below it. You can see the total copper iron sulfides, they're all throughout the system. All right. And they really like the dikes. But you can also see there is some preference for particularly the upper portion of this contact. The middle conglomerate going upwards, there seems to be greater amounts of sulfides there. And, you can now compare that to the copper equivalent greater than 0.2. And the sulfides are very predictive of copper grade and gold and silver when you add them up. And again, notice these dike intersections. This is great fracture permeability to focus fluid flow and metal deposition. And then I brought on the targets. So this thing is open to the north, to the south, at depth, and into the section or into the stock to the east. So now, having said the chalcopyrite seems to be one of the most common. In fact, it's much more common than pyrite and a bit more common than bornite. This is probably the most dominant copper sulfide recognized to date. And so now we've got the drill holes colored by copper equivalent. We've got the model, which represents the chalcopyrite as logged. And you can see, anything above 0.5% chalcopyrite is something you would be interested in. And again, chalcopyrite's made up of about 1/3 copper. So, 0.5% chalcopyrite would be about 0.15 copper. And with equivalent, you could be up to 0.2, 0.25. And something to keep in mind is that chalcopyrite is denser than the adjacent rock. So what we measure with a hand lens is volume percent. What you measure with an assay is weight percent. So if chalcopyrite was 1.5 times the density of the surrounding rock, which is mostly plagioclase and quartz, 1% chalcopyrite would really be, by volume, what you see with the hand lens would be 1.5% chalcopyrite by weight. So again, I'll compare the chalcopyrite logging to the copper greater than 0.2 from assay. And you see there's a reasonable comparison with a bit of something going on out here. Obviously, there needs to be more drilling in this vicinity here. Beautiful. So chalcopyrite's something worth caring about because it's where a lot of copper is. Again, bornite's got about 63% copper. Chalcopyrite has about 34% copper. Chalcocite has about 80% copper. So just cycling through. And again, this is that longitudinal section showing you there's a pretty good agreement to chalcopyrite to copper equivalent, which isn't surprising. So there is gold in the system, probably also sitting the chalcopyrite, maybe in the bornite with some silver. Clearly, that's where a lot of the copper is. Now, chalcopyrite to pyrite ratio is something that we as porphyry geologists use a lot to give us a vector, a bit like copper over zinc, towards the center of the system, where typically you find the most metal in many porphyries, but not all. So, and you can see how high these numbers are. So this is exceptional. There's not a lot of pyrite here as logged. In most systems, if you get 1 chalcopyrite to 9 pyrite, you're on the edge of something. 1 chalcopyrite to 2 pyrite, you're pretty much getting into it. Anything greater than 1 chalcopyrite to 1 pyrite, you're right in the high-grade guts. These numbers are very high compared to what I'm accustomed to. Every system's different, and it's just saying which way is increasing that we're going towards. But as you can see, it's a pretty good predictive tool. The chalcopyrite-pyrite ratio, which you just do with a hand lens, to actual copper equivalent grades. How nice is that? And it looks a lot like the chalcopyrite, and that's fair enough because there's not that much pyrite here, as we can see. So again, ultimately, all this will be available on the company website, and you can look at this at your leisure. I'm just talking you through the high-level aspects of it. Chalcopyrite over pyrite ratio, total sulfide abundance, chalcopyrite, all work in getting to where we want to be in drilling out a porphyry system. Good agreement with the copper, which here we can see in long section. Again, look here at the favorable stratigraphy, but of course the copper chalcopyrite grades, they love the steeper dikes. And this apparent flat dike, again, is because the section is parallel to a steep dike, all right? So very, very good. And it's not just, it's also in the Babine stock, by the way, all right? The margins are particularly important. And look at that agreement. Very, very good, all right? Chalcopyrite over pyrite ratio will get you there most of the times. And again, the system is open. So bornite, also interesting. So I did a similar thing, all from the company's logging, just adding up their various abundances from mineral 1 through mineral 4 of how they've logged it, total amount of bornite, including veins and disseminated. And you can see the relationship. And we can see up here, very hard bornite just on a few holes, but also at the intersection of the low niobium serrate dike and the copper dike. Very interesting area. And again, I think this is true in that there is good copper up here. But again, this is visually done, all right? Which geologists are good at doing. And look at the agreement between copper equivalent, which also includes gold and silver, and the log bornite. Something is going on up in here, which Makes for an exciting target. Bornite's got 63, 64% copper in it. And it floats really well. So it's what you want in many porphyry systems. Bornite and chalcopyrite in the absence of pyrite makes for a good high-grade float. And in this case, it's going to have gold. So that's great. And then I think in the long section, it's quite cool, which we'll get to. There, look at that. And that's really just informed by 1, 2, 3 holes at the intersection between, in the plane, sort of a copper dike intersecting this serrate dike of low niobium. Completely open here. Exciting. And again, there's your conglomerate dipping this way. So this is anomalous. You remember the chalcopyrite's kind of more in here. This is anomalously high for bornite. All right, and there's the copper equivalent greater than 0.2 for comparison. And clearly, this northern zone is just essentially wide open. The southern room has got plenty of room too. And even into the Babine stock. Copper over sulfur. This is assay copper, assay sulfur. This is total sulfur. And the sulfur is good because it's in sulfide minerals, but it can also be in sulfate minerals, such as anhydrite, gypsum, or barite. And there is anhydrite in the system, which is turned to gypsum locally. So we have to be a little careful because some of the sulfur is in sulfate. But in general, the higher copper over sulfur should be telling you where there's more bornite and chalcopyrite and less pyrite. Because, again, the ratio of copper over sulfur in chalcocite, let's say, would be about 4 to 1. In bornite, it would be 2.5 copper to 1 sulfur. This is atomic weights. In chalcopyrite, it's 1 to 1. In pyrite, trick question, there's no copper, so it's 0. So if you had a copper over sulfur ratio of 0.5 and you only had chalcopyrite and pyrite in your porphyry, that would be equivalent of 1 chalcopyrite to 1 pyrite, assuming there's no sulfurs only in sulfide. So this is an assay technique to help determine which way to go. But again, if you do the logging, you already know that. You don't have to wait for the assays. You don't have to worry, is it sulfide or sulfate sulfur? Now, there are analytical methods called like a LACO method that will tell you sulfide versus sulfate, but often we don't do that early on because it is expensive. So again, the colored traces are the copper equivalent in the drill holes, and then these models are made from the copper over sulfur. So very nice patterns. And again, these are just things we would use. And it's not a surprise that it's going to be very close to the copper equivalent. It's giving us an idea as the gold and silver is in the copper-bearing minerals. And again, these intersection zones are places you want to be, clearly, not only between dikes, but the margins of the intrusion of the Babine stock and dikes. And again, this is the IBS contact here. That's the dike swarm going right through the whole thing. Wonderful intersection zones of higher grade. All right. Look at that. It's kind of the whole keel of the system, but there could be multiple fingers to this thing, and there usually are. And the scale is important. All right. Each of these grids is 500 meters. All right. Lovely. Everything's coming together here. And it's not surprising that you get some of the highest grades, certainly for copper over sulfur. Longitudinal section. This is a little interesting. So you can see that bornite contribution here, because there's, copper over sulfur and bornite is 2.5, copper over sulfur and chalcopyrite is 1. And then we can see how this compares to the copper equivalent. It's not bad, but there's certainly telling you stuff up in here that's saying, hey, you would definitely keep drilling here, even though you're less than 0.2% copper. This is telling you something's down here. And doesn't seem to care as much about the stratigraphic control, interestingly enough, which is the top and bottom of the conglomerate, which is basically a preferential horizon. Everything else also dips to the east. Okay, gold. Well, everyone likes gold, particularly now, particularly if it reports to the concentrate, because this is going to be, well, this is, the money here is in the copper, even though there are good grades of gold. But you need to get the gold report to the copper concentrate to get the gold, to get the silver. We need it to float, okay? So we need it to be in the bornite and chalcopyrite. And I'm feeling quietly optimistic looking at the relationships to log minerals. It is, although subsequent microprobe work can show that. So again, now this is gold here versus copper equivalent. So this is this sort of southern gold-rich lobe. There's not as much gold in the northern area where there's the bornite, which starts coming in up in here. All right. And my guess is there's probably more chalcopyrite here with gold associated with the chalcopyrite, but we have to prove that through microprobe work and metallurgical work. But certainly this is something, the gold you have to wait for assays on, but you can then see how it relates to the minerals you can see with your hand lens. So lovely, all right? And the longitudinal section is very informative. And here you can see the gold seems to like that stratigraphy. It seems to like particularly the southern portion, the up-dip portion of the middle conglomerate. So that's kind of interesting. It does something special there. Maybe it's favorable reactivity, porosity, permeability, or both. That's a nice level. Okay. And how it compares to copper greater than 0.2, copper equivalent. All right. So, and now the last thing I wanted to share is something, again, you just get from logging, is the abundance of quartz veins. Now, what I did here is the company has given a number of different codes, and they've logged volume percent of what they call quartz, quartz bornite chalcocite, quartz tourmaline, and vein quartz. So it looks like anything above a 0.5%, and you should be able to log down to about 0.1 volume percent for your sort of, precision, or everyone, it doesn't even have to be exactly accurate. Everyone on your logging team needs to agree what 0.1 is and what 1% is for whatever they're working on, because generally more is better. So here it's contoured up by the abundance of logged quartz veins, total quartz veins. And you see above percent, even above a 0.5%, it would be very interested. And you can see here above 0.3% is kind of a nice sort of, halo to the system. Not bad. Again, you can do this as you log every day. Don't have to wait for assays for this. But, not all quartz veins have the copper sulfides that have the metals you're looking for. But quartz veins are very easy to recognize. And again, you can see this sort of northern zone really at the major dike intersection zones. Incredible. Of the copper dikes where they're kind of bending around, and then the crossing with this high scandium Seriate dike, very, very interesting. Right in the center of the conglomerate, there's the base of the conglomerate, there's the top of the conglomerate. And if we look at that in long section, you can see the quartz veins actually do kind of rise above. They certainly look very different than the gold. The gold tend to favor the middle conglomerate. The quartz veins seem to form kind of at this level and go upwards. There's more quartz veins at the middle conglomerate and higher up than there is down below. So actually kind of a nice proximity indicator if you're drilling. And clearly, this is only cutting off here. It's because there's no data there. You're going from, like 1% quartz veins to no veins, well, to no data. So this is what you want to do. You want to extend these zones with your drilling to find more veins, to find more gold and copper and silver and molybdenum. So to summarize, I think the work that the company's done to date is excellent. And I've reviewed a lot of databases in the, what would it be now, 18 years I've been an independent consultant on porphyries and epithermals and other deposit styles. And they've done well, okay? It made it really easy. So they've done well in the type of data they collected and how they've processed it. I'm quite impressed. And the real logging is really good. You could always enhance, particularly in any system. I say this with every company I work with, really make certain you do a good job down to 0.1% logging with your 20x hand lens of the sulfide mineral abundances and the veins. Very important, because that helps guide not only exploration, but it helps you with your resource modeling, and means you don't have to drill as many holes to get to a high confidence into get things into measured and indicated when you get into resources and reserves. Clearly here, the modeling of the dikes in intrusive context and the stratigraphy shows clear spatial relationships to copper, gold, silver, and molybdenum. So keep it up and use those to help predict where to put your holes to determine the higher grade zones. So I love the intrusions, the zones of dike intersections. A secondary control is the middle conglomerate. And I've demonstrated this through the longitudinal sections, through the level plans, and we actually have 3D models of all this. You can turn it all around in your sort of favorite modeling software, which the team has made. They're good geological models. I've added some numerical models, which you can easily generate in Leapfrog for the properties I just shared to you in section and level plan. And things that I like, obviously the copper equivalent, depending for the drill holes, it's using copper, gold, and silver. The company has also used molybdenum, although it's a very minor value component of the copper equivalent. But, copper, gold, molybdenum, copper over zinc, copper over sulfur, gold over copper. These are all things that can be used that help you vector in. The higher those sorts of ratios, typically the closer to where you want to be. The log copper-bearing sulfide minerals, chalcopyrite ratio, bornite chalcopyrite ratio can be useful, quartz vein abundance. Other elements I haven't discussed, which often are good pathfinders, which will work here because I've looked at the data and other consultants have mentioned this. Silver, arsenic, bismuth, manganese, lead, zinc, and tungsten. These all are kind of distal to proximal pathfinders for porphyry coppers. So I'm really liking the relationship of the logging done by the company for the copper and iron-bearing sulfides, a great predictive tool. And the magnetics and IP resistivity integrated with the sort of regional copper over zinc and moly, and you could use other elements, arsenic, bismuth, manganese, are really helpful in delineating other targets. And these can be processed even further. The magnetics can have lots more processing, which is excellent. Why not? Why wouldn't you? You spent money getting that mag survey. You have so much value. It's very expensive to drill 5 to 10 meters of diamond drill hole. So process the magnetics and any other data you can use, such as geochemistry, to help determine 3D models or probabilities of porphyry deposit discovery. Again, a lot of this relates back to something I give talks on, the anaconda method. It's been around for over 100 years. It's just good geology. It's just basically deciding what's important to map and log in your drill core and doing that exceedingly well, and then using that as vectors to help you focus your exploration. So on summary, I like the system. It's early days, but there's some hundreds of meters of good results. We've made models down 1,000 meters now. It could be large, and that's just the existing system, all right? At over 500 million tons, perhaps, if you want to apply a cutoff. That's the target, okay? I'm not saying it's there yet, and I'm not a resource geologist. There's no resource here, but that's the sort of target. If someone said, well, what are you looking for? I would say that, and that's just the known area. What about finding some of these potential satellite discoveries, which is quite common, because in many of these systems, it's the fingers on the hand. And working in Ecuador with SolGold on Apala, we had about 6 fingers that were surface outcrops and zones of higher surface geochem that we said, hey, we're interested in this. And when we drilled it down to 1.5 kilometers or deeper, all those fingers came into the hand. So what looked quite small at surface became a 3.5 billion ton ore body. So that's why we care about geometry. And there is cover here. So that's highlighting that there could be a lot more to be found, but also, something that has to be thought about in exploration too. So thank you for your time. Again, I believe the company will put all this on their website in one form or the other, including this talk. Have a good day.